Hello! I'm at a different location today. Over the weekend I'm staying at a friend's place to dog sit, and I've decided to come prepared, and I brought a bunch of books with me to read, because all of this time provides me with an opportunity to focus on things that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So yeah, and I already finished one of the books, and it's one of the books that I mentioned in my previous video, one of my latest purchases, All That Remains by Sue Black, and I have quite a few things to say about it. So, before that, the first thing I want to mention is that I'm sorry for my voice. I'm on a tail end of a cold, so sorry for that. No other side effects. I'm feeling good, but yeah, the voice is a bit weird. But then the second thing is that all of the praise for the design of this place goes to my friend. This is not my place. So, yeah, she has a good eye for it, and it's a cool aesthetic. Not particularly how I would decorate my place, but it's pretty cool, and I like it here. So all of the praise goes to her. Now, yeah, so let's just get into the book, I guess. So what this book is about, it's, as you might have intuited if you've seen any of my previous videos, or just like even looked at them, it's something to do with like something very heavily centered around death, and all that comes with it. Seems to be one of my favorite types of books to read recently. Yeah, so what this is so Sue Black is like a leading forensic anthropologist in Scotland. To be honest, before reading this book, I've never heard about her, but, you know, reading the book, like, she seems to have, like, done a lot of really, really cool stuff, and even pioneering some of, like, techniques that are really, really fascinating. So she's the GOAT, for real. Yeah, so this book is just mostly, like, a general discussion by her of what her like occupation as a forensic anthropologist have given her in life, and the places it led her, what a forensic anthropologist even is, and like just a lot of stuff around this. And you know, as someone who confronts death every single day on a regular basis, yeah, there's just a lot of very interesting things she has to say about the topic, and an approach to death that I really resonate with. Maybe not in all places, but mostly. Yeah. So I guess the way I'll do it, I'll just kind of go through. I'll do a little bit like a low-key sort of just chapter by chapter, like surface level discussion, just going through the chapters and like what each of them is about, if I even remember what it is about. Because some of these are, you know, of course, naturally in any book, but specifically in like a non-fiction book that has to do with a lot of, you know, all of this stuff is related to death in one way or another, but it's also pretty like a varied selection of topics. And so naturally some of them I'm more familiar with, some of them I'm less familiar with, some of them I'm more interested in, some of them I'm less interested in, and you know, that kind of thing. So yeah, some of them I will have something to say about, some of them are really, really fascinating to me, some of them I just skimmed through. There's one section that I straight up just skipped and I didn't read for reasons that I will discuss later. Yeah. So the first, just to kind of, I guess I didn't have a overall sort of didn't state my overall impression of the book, but pretty good book. Especially, like, I would really, really recommend reading it, especially if, you know, if this kind of thing, if you look at it and you're like, damn, that's interesting, yeah, that book is for sure for you if you're at all interested in those kinds of topics. And especially if you have any sort of feelings and points of view about death and bodies that would be really, really difficult to explain to your mom, for sure. I don't know if you've seen any of my previous videos, but I have a bit of a very special relationship with death and view of it, seeing how I made an entire video about like essential reading on necrophilia, and like books that explore it, both fiction and non-fiction books. So yeah, and I'm the person who recently has been known to a lot of my friends as that one girl who introduced me to necrophilia. So I have a very particular interest in this on many levels. If you want to learn more about it, watch my video about essential reading on necrophilia. There I kind of try to explain why this whole topic is interesting to me and why it draws me in with a particular consistent strength. But yes, so when I'm discussing all of this, I guess it's just a bit of a context for how some of my opinions about this book and feelings about this book might have been formed, and in which context they might have been formed, and also as a bit of a, I guess not really a content warning, but kind of like just for you to expect that some things that I mention and like some perspectives that I will have on some of the chapters of this book and the concepts discussed in it might be a bit unorthodox, if you will. But yeah, with all of that out of the way, let's just kind of start. I'll just go through every single chapter of the book and just kind of try to explain what it's about. So, of course, there's like an introduction. It's an introduction. It's fine. There's nothing, you know, it's a few pages long. Nothing particular, whatever. The first chapter is called Silent Teachers. And it's more or less about how it introduces sort of the context under which the author's view of death and like interest in death and why she gravitated towards her occupation, in the sense that, as the chapter title suggests, the dead, as in the bodies of the dead, can teach us a lot of things. You know, this is a very like surface level concept of it, but yeah, and in this chapter she just basically also explains some of her very early like childhood experiences, and like some very basic strokes, how she has gotten into her occupation as a forensic anthropologist, and like what a forensic anthropologist even is. As it's the very beginning of the book, it's at this point it's explained in very like basic terms, but still very interesting, because I didn't know that there is a separate like field called forensic anthropology as opposed to forensic pathology, you know. But like it makes total sense, but I've never personally considered it, even as someone who's like really interested in like death and dissections or like true crime and that kind of stuff. Maybe to a slightly unhealthy degree, but yeah, I didn't know that. And to be honest, this first chapter contains, like, is one of the most interesting to me, particularly for one section in it. It's like a few pages long. It's like three and a half pages long. That even if the entire rest of the book was completely uninteresting, this one segment of the first chapter would have carried me through the book, just to, with how much expectation and hype it built for me for the entire book and the potential contents of it. So yeah, even if the book wasn't that interesting, which it is interesting, but even if it weren't, these few pages I've noted where the section is. So like, yeah, it's like 3.5, maybe like 3 3/4 pages. And this is probably the section that I'm gonna remember the most, because these few pages have to do with, well, the author describes in the very meticulous graphic detail her first dissection as a student of anatomy. And this is this is straightforwardly the most detailed, first of all, description of a dissection that I've ever read, at least in a non-fiction book. But also one of the most sensual things I've ever read, especially in a non-fictional book, and one of probably the most necroerotic description of a dissection that I've ever read in a non-fiction book. If you end up reading this book, prepare to feel things that you wouldn't expect to have felt potentially at any point in your life. I don't know how intentional it is, because it doesn't feel like the whole eroticism of death is touched on in the entirety of the book. So I feel like this might be just my point of view of it, and just it tells more about me than about the author's intentions, which, yeah, probably that's the case. But also, I've shared this section of the book with a bunch of my friends, and consistently they've said, damn, this is just freaky as hell. And once again, we couldn't, of course we don't know if this was intentional. But once again, if you ever end up reading this, prepare to just feel things. Let's just end it on that, because if I get deeper into that, it's going to be a bit difficult for me to keep a straight face and discuss it further. But that's the first chapter. And the next chapter is called Ourselves and Ourselves, and it's also pretty it's like a banger of a chapter. It discusses a lot of super basics of how our bodies are made out of cells, and what kind of cells, what types of cells there are, and how they develop throughout our lifespan, and then from inception to to death, and then also after that, of course, how our cells and our bodies, our tissues, decay after death. This particular section was really, really interesting to me. Once again, considering my propensities and what interests me about all of this. This is the first time that I've read a full-on description of a list and description of all the kind of scientifically from a point of view of like scientific consideration from the point of view of the field of forensics, be it like forensic or anatomy, you know, all of this stuff, but like particularly forensics, the stages of decay of the body and what they entail. And there are 7 stages of decay, and some of them I've heard before, some of them I didn't. And yeah, this was really, really, really fascinating, really, really educational for sure. Because once again, I've heard about all these different stages of death, like most of them at least, but I didn't know the particular like order in which they come and some of the interesting considerations. Because, for example, there is this the 4th phase of decay is called livor mortis, and it's where the body starts acquiring like a bluish color. And what was particularly interesting, that it was something that I've never considered before, is that if there were any, if the body was moved and like turned around in any way, like during this stage, there are like a pretty particular things you can look for to see that was the case, and like how the body might have been moved. So I'll just quote it, because it would be a bit difficult for me to explain myself, and you know, she of course explains it the best way possible. The heavier red blood cells sink through the serum and accumulate in the lower gravitational regions. Eventually, the skin here will turn a darker red or purple-blue color as a result of the concentration of red blood cells, in striking contrast to the pallor of the skin at the higher levels. Where the skin comes into contact with the surface, for example, if the body is lying on its back, blood is pushed out of the tissues into adjacent areas where there is no contact pressure. So the contact areas will appear paler compared to the darker surrounding areas of lividity. Maximum lividity is generally reached within 12 hours, as in within 12 hours after death. The liver coloration then becomes fixed and can be a useful indicator in the investigation of suspicious death. It may reveal how a body was positioned in the hours immediately after death and help us to evaluate whether it might subsequently have been moved. A body with marks of lividity on its back but found lying on its face has clearly been turned over. If someone has died by hanging, there will be a pooling of blood in the lower segments of all 4 limbs, and this fixed lividity pattern will remain in the distal arms and legs even after the body is cut down. So this is something that makes total sense when you read about it, but something like I haven't considered before, even though I kind of knew that this is generally something that happens, that blood kind of starts pooling to death. But like, yeah, this is the kind of like the really interesting thing about this section, is like all of this, like all of these details put together in like concise sequential list is yeah, something that was really, really interesting to me here. I don't remember much more about this section. There's sometimes in these sections there's what's kind of interspersed with other information. It's more sort of like legal aspects of forensic anthropology. There's a lot of stuff that has to do like how different organizations are contacted if like a body is found and they're trying to like find DNA matches, where the DNA banks are located around, like what kind of organizations have control over and like manage the DNA banks. And like there's a lot of this kind of legal aspects interspersed with all of the other stuff in the entirety of the book, more or less. And I would say for me, it's one of the, I wouldn't say least interesting aspects, but like, it is interesting for me, but yes, there's not enough like emotional resonance with it. It's not something I like ever really think about. So like, yeah, it is cool to know, but it's probably something I won't pay mind to like going forward. It's something that I'm probably gonna forget. But I can see how to a lot of people this might be really interesting. So the next couple of chapters, the one that's called Death in the Family, and then the other one, Death Up Close and Personal. I don't remember much about them, besides them just, the author just telling some of her personal experience with, well, death in the family. And yeah, I don't know. Once again, pretty interesting, but in the context of like what I find interesting in this book, it's not on the top sort of. It's not on the top, like at the top of the list of what's interesting to me in this book. But once again, really cool to hear all of this like super personal, like emotional, emotional recollections of the author's experience, like really foundational experiences with like death in the family. So the next section is Ashes to Ashes, and it's mostly to deal with there's a little bit of stuff, there's a bit of continuation of the whole like author's recollections of death in the family that she encountered, and but also some of it has to do with just the options of a person who died, and like what are their options as to like what is going to happen to their body. And like, of course, like the basic stuff is like mentioned, like, you know, cremation and burial, that's the word, but also like all of the alternatives, because being who she is, the author is really interested in all of the alternatives. And one of them is, of course, donation to like science and to, you know, anatomical kind of the purposes of anatomical study and all of that kind of stuff. And that's interesting. There's like a personal case of like a person who wants to donate his body to anatomical study in the particular university that the author works at. There's there's some stuff touching on like assisted death and all of the kind of a brief sort of explanation of the most basic pro and contra arguments for this thing, for this kind of idea. And assisted death is, of course, you know, euthanasia or like medically assisted suicide kind of thing. Also very, very interesting, but it doesn't go too deep into it, but it goes to some depth here, and yeah, interesting. It mentions, this chapter also mentions, like, very briefly, the Body Worlds exhibition, the relatively famous / infamous like museum exhibitions, installations of like plastinated bodies, which one of those, I'm not too familiar with those, but at least one of those exhibitions is pretty regularly held here where I live. I've never been to it. Maybe I will go to it one time. It will be cool, I guess, but I don't know. It is interesting, and it probably at some point in time I will end up going to it. But also, the fact that it's more or less like your body's turned to like plastic and exhibited as sculptures, it is interesting to me personally from like I guess like chemical perspective of like how all like physical and chemical reaction perspective of like how all of this happens with the body, like how the body is like turned into plastic basically. But like emotionally and from the point of view of that sort of spiritual and like erotic side of death and dissections and all that kind of stuff that I'm really interested in, doesn't really resonate that much with me. But yeah, there's that. The next section is this one. There's some interesting stuff, I guess, to do with like how historically remains of people have been kind of dealt with when there is, for example, kind of overpopulation in cemeteries or stuff like that. How like there's like layering of remains and like some of the legal aspects of it, like how it happens in like big cities still to this day, where like there's so many people that there's literally just not enough like cemetery area, and so how all of this stuff is like layered burials or something like that. There's pretty interesting stuff. And just in general, how it's a bit of a continuation on some of the ways that we deal with remains, deal with them or dispose of them, or those kinds of things. What I really find interesting here is that there's a brief section that mentions like basically cannibalism, like different forms of cannibalism, but not like in the sense, not really in the like ritual, spiritual kind of sense of like cannibalism that people tend to think about, but like more utilitarian in a way, because for example, there's this like a few paragraphs that like mention like this like recipe from a Franciscan apothecary from 1679 for human blood jam, and just some of the other like similar things of like how bodies were turned into some sort of like edible thing, quite often through some like, quote unquote medical or restorative considerations. So the whole regenerative death consumption kind of thing. But as of yet, I still haven't found the book that goes full on into the whole regenerative death consumption aspect. If someone knows, let me know if someone knows a work or an article, scientific article or a book like that, because it's something that's really, really interesting to me. And I would love to delve deeper into that at some point. It's a very fascinating area as well. But yeah, this chapter just kind of continues with some of the alternatives of how remains are dealt with. Next one, Not Forgotten. There is just the thing that I remember about it is that there's just a pretty extensive discussion of a case that the author has worked on that has been that had to with trying to revisiting a cold case, a cold murder case from decades ago. It's just, I don't know, kind of true crime stuff, and some of the legal, once again, some of the legal aspects of how all of these exhumations and I guess excavation sites are kind of managed from the legal point of view when revisiting cold cases from decades ago. Some of the discussion of how viable it is and how how important, like, how much chance there is to actually do any difference in finding more information about a cold murder case from like decades ago by trying to find the remains when like 30, 40, 50 years have passed since the case happened. Yeah, the next one, Invenerund corpus, body found. This one, it's probably the one section that I kind of skimmed through the most, as in like, not skimmed through the most, as in I went through it multiple times, but in like, this is the chapter that I read on the most like surface level, because it just mostly has to do with like a lot of what happens when they find like an unidentified body, and all of the like procedures, both from the point of view like forensic sciences and from like once again legal perspectives of like what happens, like what they do. Here's the first step, and to me, I don't know. It's just not something like, it is interesting of course, but like in the larger scope of things that interest me, this is not really high on my list of priorities. And I guess this is like my personal bias in a way, and I assume you might have a similar bias. I don't know. If you queer, especially in any way, is that a lot of this stuff, a lot of the like legal and scientific procedures that had to do with like identification of bodies, has to do with a lot of pretty archaic, in my point of view, system of assigning like biological sex to corpses, and a lot of this kind of stuff, which I understand why it's needed, and I understand like it's okay, it's fine, but like it just it doesn't really don't really vibe with it that much. But like it's okay, it's kind of interesting. But I was kind of afraid that like I guess being me, and I assume some people watching this might also understand this. Once again, if you're like queer in any way, or like trans or non-binary, something, that when people just start noticing like the scientific notions of like biological sex and like hormones, and like it gives a vibe, which like, but I think it's the author kind of, she is of a certain generation, so I understand why she doesn't spend too much time kind of saying that all of this stuff is, archaic in some ways. But I think she handles all of this like as best as she can, without, and to be honest, this is the first, and it kind of, I got a little bit like calmed down, and like, a little bit of my anxiety got removed when she does actually mention like, oh, like some people can go through like transgender surgeries, and so the kind of sex of the body is like not always the presence of that certain like sexual organ doesn't necessarily, So she mentioned it, so that's cool. She doesn't dwell too much on it, unfortunately. I love dwelling on that kind of stuff, but anyways. So this is the section that I kind of skimmed through. It's fine, but not particularly interesting to me. Yeah. And then we have this one section that is also probably kind of like the first chapter of this book that I meant, the very first chapter of this book, when I mentioned that there's like this one specific section which has the description of a dissection, and a very central one of that. This is kind of on this, almost on the same level of emotional resonance to me personally. This is the one that I really like just coming into like, you know, turning the page and seeing this. I'm like, that's the stuff. That's what I'm interested in. That's what I'm interested in. That's what gets me going in a way. That sounds weird, but yeah, that's something that's really interesting to me. And yeah, this is like another chapter that I'm gonna remember the most, and probably gonna like revisit the most, just to like for all of the like facts and like all this information. Yeah, there's like a bit of statistics on how much dismemberment, like how much, like all we think it actually is when it comes to like murders. How much of murder cases include any sort of dismemberment, and apparently very few. Like, I don't know, once again, this is one of those cases where it's probably my personal bias, and as someone who has been pretty like exposed to a lot of true crime, and as someone who has been in the whole like extreme metal scene for a very long time, been exposed to a lot of, you know, art and media that kind of explore or even glorify in some way, whether intentionally or unintentionally, the whole like, you know, like dismemberment, gore, like that kind of stuff. My mind tends to kind of overestimate the presence of the stuff, and it's something that it has always seemed like so omnipresent. It's like, oh yeah, this is stuff that always happens, but like apparently not. So the statistics is that I'll just quote, of the 500 to 600 murders a year that take place in the UK, approximately not 300, three singular, are recorded as involving criminal dismemberment. So like it's so much less than I expected. But it's kind of nice to know that all of the stuff that is happening in my head is like, it's not really reflective of reality. That's kind of nice to know, for once. Yeah, and also the other point of kind of information that supports this is that there's a sentence that says basically that most police officers are never faced with any like dismemberment, any cases of murder including dismemberment in their entire careers, and if they are, of the few lucky/unlucky who are, it's probably just going to be one in their entire career. So like, once again, apparently it's much less common than I tend to think. So yeah, and then this is the stuff that's really, really interesting to me, that I've never kind of heard about it, but never heard of this kind of idea, classification before, but it's really interesting. So there are 5 main classifications of criminal dismemberment from the point of view of like forensic sciences, and they are all essentially based on the intent of the perpetrator. And they list all of these types and what they are. So the most common one, occurring in about 85% of cases, is defensive dismemberment, which is like, it's such a weird name because it gives a weird picture of what it is, and I think it's not the very apt name for it, but it's basically defensive dismemberment, at least from this point of view, from the point of view of forensic sciences and from the point of view of this particular classification of it. It's when someone's trying to just dispose of the body, and like, damn, it's going to be easier to make if it's in parts, and they do that to, you know. So I don't know why they called it defensive dismemberment, but okay, we have what we have. Yeah. And there's like, this is where there's so much information that is so interesting to me. There's all of this like particular details of damn, just saying this out loud, especially with this kind of expression on my face, feels a bit weird, but I don't know, it's something that's really interesting to me, and it's like there's so much information of like what are the usual patterns of how people try to do it, how people try to dismember the body when they do it. What are of course she doesn't, for legal and like I guess moral reasons, she doesn't give she wouldn't give recommendations and like straight up guides to how to do it most effectively, but she mentions stuff that is kind of around this, and like, this is effective, this is usually not effective, this is how people usually try to do it, this is what's usually successful, this is what's usually not successful, and this is what I'm like reading it for. It's really, really interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff. Here is one of the sections that I noted the most of on. I don't know if you see, there's like a bunch of stuff that I noted with my pen, whatever. This is the most. This is the section of the book that I've made the most of these notes. One of the wildest things that I've never heard about before is that there is apparently a way to kind of figure out if the person, if the body of the dead person, if the person had tattoos in any place whatsoever on their body, even if you don't have that specific part of the body on which they had a tattoo. And the way it happens is because apparently all of the tattoo ink that with time slowly kind of gets deposited into the hypodermis and then like transported out of the initial like site of the tattoo, it apparently accumulates in your lymph nodes and colors your lymph nodes like from the inside with the color of the ink. I've never heard it before, and it sounds so cool to me. It's such a fascinating thing. And so yeah, if you have tattoos, at some point in time, all of this ink that gets like slowly kind of metabolized by your body, it will get kind of deposited into your lymph nodes. There's like I don't have familiar so the most kind of like concentrated areas, the areas that have the most like concentration, the biggest concentration of lymph nodes are the armpits and the groin. And so yeah, this is where, and so it's basically, there's this thing where like, even like, for example, someone has like a tattoo on their arm, on their left arm, right, like I have. Even if the body shows up without that left arm, you can actually kind of like cut it like into the lymph node and like look at the lymph node, and if it's colored in any way that's like unnatural, it's like, oh yeah, there was probably a tattoo on the left arm. And that is one of the wildest things I've learned recently. Very fascinating to me, yeah. Okay, so this has all started with me like quoting the whole classification of types of dismemberment. So yeah, that was like the first one and most common, 85% of cases of defensive dismemberment. Then the second one is aggressive dismemberment, which is like someone more or less during the process of the murder or whatever, just kind of gets so angry that they unintentionally dismember a person. The third one is offensive dismemberment, which is like more or less what gets really, really represented and overrepresented in media and art, especially in certain kinds of scenes and genres, is the the intentional dismemberment, the sort of like, oh yeah, I'm doing it for a specific reason, and that reason not being ease of disposal of the body afterwards. It's like this is the stuff that's usually this is usually the classification, like it's represented. This is the category in this classification that's mostly represented by like some sort of like sexual motive, like sexual dismemberment kind of thing, which I think is something that gets overrepresented in media and art. Then the fourth one is kind of related to it in a way, and I don't know why they kind of. It's a question to me whether this separation into two different categories is needed at all, and it's like this fourth category is necromantic, not necromantic, but necromantic dismemberment, as in it's like basically keepsakes. It's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna cut off their like tongue and keep it for myself as a memento, which to me personally feels a bit, I don't know if we need to. There is a question, of course, of like whether we need to separate this category from the previous one of the offensive, but like whatever. And then the fifth one is I've never heard this name before, but like it makes sense, and I kind of was aware of this happening. Is the communication dismemberment, which sounds kind of cool, but like it's not cool. It's what like more or less what gangs do for various purposes, to like communicate with each other, or like it's very unfortunate. All of this is very unfortunate, but like this one is specifically, to me, is kind of like yeah. So I've been going about this section for quite a lot, but like yeah, this is the section where like it's just, you will learn so much like specific like jargon and like terms and names of like different bones and like parts of the body, and like all of this kind of very sort of straight up like forensic stuff, and it was really interesting to me. So the next chapter, this is the one and only chapter that I just didn't read it at all. I skipped it. This is the chapter, Kosovo. I think it's pretty obvious what it's about. The author has worked in Kosovo in 1999 and 2000 during that whole thing. And the reason I skipped it is because it just hits too close to home. I'm not Serbian, I'm not Albanian, I'm not like, from that area, so it's not that kind of hits close to home, but I'm Ukrainian, and the stuff that's been happening there in Kosovo and like that area is so reminiscent of what's happening right now and has been happening for the last 3 years in Ukraine that it's just, reading this is just like, I don't know. I literally don't know if I have the emotional capacity to just read it, because it's just re-traumatizing. Like, even as someone who has very luckily been not like affected by war in Ukraine, like in the sense that like I'm not in immediate danger of like getting like killed or something like that, because I don't live in Ukraine anymore. But it's still something that affects you no matter what, especially when you have like friends and like family still living there, having like to worry every day about that stuff. And yeah, that's why I skipped that section. At some point of time I want to read it, because like, but like, just so it's not because of like disrespect or something. It's I just cannot. It just currently hits a bit close to home. You don't really, war is something you never really truly understand until it literally just happens to you. Like, you can read about all of the atrocities and like books and like but when it actually happens to you, your entire world gets flipped upside down, and there's so much happens to your worldview that I don't know, it would take hours for me to even elaborate on all of that. But like, yeah, that's why I skipped that section. But like, I will try to read it at some point of time when all of that stuff in Ukraine is over. Hopefully soon. I don't know. Anyways, that one was. I'm sorry for that one, but like, what can you do? The next section, when disaster strikes, and it's mostly about natural disasters and disaster victim identification and all that kind of stuff. Also, a lot of like legal aspects of it, and it mostly has to do with the author's experience with the 2004 like whole tsunami thing in 2004 around the Indian Ocean coastlines, like Thailand, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, that kind of area, where it was like one of the biggest. I'll try to find the citation. So yeah, over 250,000 people died, and 40,000 were reported missing, and millions were displaced. So it's like it's insane. It's like unbelievable levels of like damage. And so she goes into all of that, a lot of how it worked. This probably has, to me personally, one of the like most disturbing sections of the book, where just when something like that happens, the amount of bodies that just like turn up and need to be identified is so large that like they're just being like piled, and like, yeah, they're just like being piled, and there's not enough accommodations to like slow the rate of decay, and so all of the ensuing stuff is described pretty much in detail here, and it's very, yeah, it's a bit difficult to read through, but like I guess it's important. So yeah, that's something that's a bit of a difficult section, but important one for sure. Yeah, next one, fate, fear, and phobias. This one I don't remember much about, unfortunately. There are like few things that I've noticed, that I've like noted here. I guess, yeah. So the most important thing is one of the most important thing is that the author goes about her own phobias, as in like she, like a lot of other people in like forensic area, gets quite often asked like, damn, how do you deal with all of that, and like, aren't you afraid of like, you know, bothered by all of this? And she explains a lot of this, and what are her personal phobias and how they don't really have anything to do with the dead, and there's something other. And a lot of, that's actually what I remember from the section. It is really interesting. Just forgot there for a second. There's a part of it where she talks through the psychological part of like dealing with all of the stuff that she has to deal with, and all of the techniques for compartmentalization of all of this stuff related with like death and all of that unfortunate stuff, and how it affects or doesn't affect her in various areas. And from especially as someone who has a lot of her own like traumatic experience, maybe not necessarily with death, but with some other things. That was really interesting to see how other people deal with their trauma, and how they, So that was actually pretty cool to read. There's also a very interesting thing that's like about this sort of forensic technique that I've never heard about before, And it's apparently there's this thing of like there's the way of like a relatively new, or at least the idea is not new. Like a lot of ideas, they're not new, but like the practice of it is relatively new. Is this technique of identifying vein patterns in people, because apparently like vein patterns are more or less unique to every person, kind of like fingerprints, while arteries, which supply oxygenated blood like directly from the heart to like all of the parts of your body, they have a relatively consistent pattern throughout all of the people, because they just, they need to be like the most efficient they possibly can be, because they supply the oxygenated blood to all of your body, which is pretty important. So they need to be like super specific in like how they go around. But with veins, which take away the deoxygenated blood from all of the parts of your body that like don't need it anymore, to pull it back in the heart, there's a bit of a less requirement to be like super efficient with it. So like irregularities start happening, and and especially like the further away the veins are from the heart, the more like variety there is, like interpersonal variety, and so vein pattern identification is apparently like a technique that is used now in forensics, like in the forensic area. And the way they do it is like very interesting. I've never heard about this before. The way they do it is that they take pictures of people's like hands with like infrared cameras, because apparently, because veins have deoxygenated blood, because of the properties of deoxygenated blood compared to oxygenated blood, a lot of the like infrared spectrum radiation gets absorbed by that blood, by the deoxygenated blood. And so when you take a picture of someone's hand in like IR, like in infrared, all of the like hand will be visible, but the veins would be like black. So there's this kind of thing, and it's used as like the metaphor that's used here is like the barcode of a human, like in a weird way. Never heard about this technique before, but it seems absolutely fascinating to me. There's also like something that's unfortunate is like the author is one of the people who's kind of rediscovered this technique and like kind of introduced it into modern forensic sciences by like improving on it from like previous people who kind of pioneered it in like previous decades and even centuries. And the case in which he like kind of the case that served as like as a kickstart for all of that for her and like her colleagues is a case of child abuse, and that's all unfortunate. And she explains how all of this happened, and as it often happens, very unfortunately, in addition to all of that, like new techniques being developed and all of this stuff, one of the most important takeaways from all this is that children are just not being trusted when it comes to providing like evidence, even of something that's literally happened to them, of some terrible stuff that happened to them. People just don't trust children. And that is really terrible. And in that case, unfortunately, at least as much as the author was involved in it, it seems like the perpetrator was like left just free, even though they more or less identified that by using this vein pattern thing, they more or less identified by all standards who the perpetrator was, and it was the child's father. It was her father. He was left, for a lot of really, really unfortunate reasons that has to do with, first of all, people not trusting children for some reason, and second of all, patriarchal structures and how women are, and by extension, girls are trusted much less than non-women, non-girls. It keeps happening. It keeps happening. And I hate it. And we should do something about it. Anyways, next chapter is one of the last ones. An ideal solution. It's pretty so it's mostly about improving the techniques of preserving bodies for anatomical study, and it also includes like an introduction into a very, very cool technique that I've never heard before, and that was more or less pioneered by this author in Scotland with the help of a lot of other people. And it's this cool thing, the Thiel method. Thiel is like a last name of a guy who pioneered the idea. And it's, instead of using formalin, which is changes the physical characteristics of a body when it's being preserved in formalin, and it gives the skin and most of the body a very darkish kind of brown color, and it makes all of the tissues and especially the skin of very, very rigid and inflexible, so it becomes of less use in actually teaching anatomy, because the way formalinated tissues react and flex, or how they don't flex more or less, and all the physical characteristics usually just don't correspond to those of real bodies. So that's the first thing, the issue with formalin. And the second issue with formalin is that it's known to be carcinogenic. So, working with it, it's just dangerous to the living people. And so there's a sort of search for new techniques. And the author, in conjunction with some of her colleagues, they more or less tested and introduced, improved on this thing called the Thiel technique, where the bodies are basically left in a very specific solution of salts and some other stuff. There's a tiny bit of formalin they add to it, but it's very, very tiny amount, and it's mostly to just act as a fungicide. But all of the other stuff, it's mostly different salts. And so the bodies are left in this solution for a couple of months, and by the end of the process, the bodies are preserved. There's the fungicidal, the bactericidal kind of effect, so it's all getting sterilized more or less, which is what kind of one requirement. The second requirement, that is kind of not even a requirement, the improvement on the formalin method, is that the flexibility of the tissues actually is preserved, which is kind of insane, because we've been working with the forensic sciences have been working with those, not even forensic sciences, but more anatomy departments everywhere, and anatomy students have been learning anatomy through formalinated bodies, which don't really act the way that real tissue acts, the real tissue that they might need to operate on as surgeons or as forensic scientists. So the fact that we found like a better alternative to formalin is kind of wild. That it's like preserves the flexibility of the tissues more or less. It also apparently, because of the just, I guess, the general sort of because the bodies are being left in this sort of solution for months, it just moisturizes the body in like a very deep way, and it apparently smooths out wrinkles, and the body started becoming start looking a bit younger than it's pretty wild what it does. And also, like, as a thing is that all of the hair on the body is completely like dissolved through all of this, and I think fingernails as well. But besides that, all of the stuff is fully preserved, and and the author and some other, like a bunch of other people, they were basically did this like whole campaign, and it was really fascinating to like read about it, to just crowdfund more or less like a couple of $1 million, like pounds, to build a first in the world field technique body preservation facility, which is, to me, is like, it's so cool. That is political action. That is like, it's so cool to me. So yeah, this is more or less the last section of the book, and I guess it leaves on like a very nice note, really like uplifting note, I think. And then after that, there's just an epilogue where the author more or less just kind of the author more or less just kind of ruminates on what she personally wants to happen to her when she dies, how she wants to go, what her experience, what her what she wants her final kind of communication experience with death to be. And that is something that I find very interesting. And I also, what really, really resonates with me through the entirety of the book, and especially with this section, is how the author consistently casts death as a her, which, to me, resonates a lot. This is how I view death. I see her as a her. Coincidentally, as any deities and spirits that figure in my personal belief system, it's a her. Girl boss, feminism, if you will. But yeah, no, that's pretty like short but interesting chapter, and that ends the book. So, by the amount of stuff that I have to say, you could guess that I recommend this book, and I really, really liked it. So, if any of this is interesting to you, read it. Read it. I don't know how much it costs. I don't like a new one, because the copy that I found is a second-hand copy. It's a bit like damaged. There's a bit of water damage, but I like it. I like the personality of the damage to the book. It's all like a bit rough. I like it. I found it as in like a second-hand bookstore for a very small sum. I don't know how much a new one would cost, but I don't think it's that much. But yeah, if any of this is interesting to you, for sure, read this stuff. Read this stuff. You're gonna... Yeah, if any of this resonates with you, read it. Big recommend. Especially, once again, if you have a very particular interest, a very particular relationship with death and bodies, and that particularly if you find yourself drawn to death and bodies in a very particular way, which is difficult to explain to people, this is for you. This is for the weird girls, for sure. So yeah, that's the thing. This is a long-ass video, and if you watched all of it, I don't know why you would, tolerate me and my company for so long, but thank you so much. This is legitimately very, very important to me. The one thing that I would probably leave with is that none of my videos will ever be sponsored in any way by anyone besides myself, because of what kind of stuff I cover. So the only way to, like, the way you can in any way, like, support me is to just check out some of the stuff that I do, some of my personal, like, art and work. And so my current, like, main thing that I do is this sort of meta-fiction universe called Books of Pleasure, which is about a convent of, like, esoteric lesbian nuns with, like, their own personal belief system, which you can also read about. I have an entire document about that belief system. I'll leave the links in the description. And yeah, I just release this whole thing in, like, a series of zines, like these little books that I fully, like, I make them on my own. I go print them. I make all of the design for them. I make all of the writing for them. I, like, bind them. I do it all by hand, and it's pretty expensive to do by hand. So the only way I can, like, continue doing it is just, like, you know, yeah, I wouldn't be able to do it if, like, on my own. I'm only able to do it because people actually support it and actually buy it. So I'll leave the links where you can check it out. It's mostly on my Instagram. The first 3 chapters of the Books of Pleasure series have already been published. Like, I've already given them, like, to, like, free access. And soon I'm gonna give free access to this one as well, chapter 4. Yeah, you can check that out. And if you're in, for some reason, for some forsaken reason, you like them enough to, like, that you want, like, a physical handmade copy from me, with a bunch of, like, personalized stuff and, like, cards that I make by hand, you can just contact me on Instagram, and we'll figure that out. But that's about it. I don't know. Let me know if you have any thoughts, if you've read this book, or if you're planning to read it, or if you have any book that is similar to this and that you would recommend. For sure, I'm all for it. I love this kind of stuff, and I want to research more and more of it in the future. So let me know for sure, and have a good one, and I'll see you in the next video whenever it happens.